many times, Lord, have I been cared for? Every step you've been with.
Hey everyone, welcome to Groundbreakers to Harvesters. We're really excited for this season. It's Church Planting 101, and it's a conversation between Gerry and I and kind of how we got into church planting, what is it about Apostolic Church Planting that we're currently engaged in, and how you and your family might be able to really wrestle with church planting, and is this for you? And so with that in mind, I'd like to invite Gerry to the conversation. So hello, Gerry. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
You know what? We're coming into Thanksgiving week. We've just wrapped up a ton of busyness in my family's life. And so I am doing well. I'm being restored right now. Have you ever had those moments where you've been running and you finally get a break and you're like, oh, it's just good to be renewed and restored?
It is, and I'll tell you, it's God's plan for us, though, right? Is that Sabbath and that rest in Him, and
yep.
But in church planting, it's kind of hard sometimes.
You always have the phone. In fact, this morning when we got together a half hour late because this morning a guy from the neighborhood that we connect with, he works the graveyard shift, and so when he gets off at 8 a.m. is kind of when my morning starts, and sometimes we grab cigars together. And so he's like, "Hey, I want to come over and let's talk." So he came over to the house this morning, and we grabbed an early morning cigar. I know. Don't judge me. I know. It stinks. It's horrible. But it's a great, it's like, guys, we don't connect over coffee shops. We connect over doing something and connecting. And so, he smoked a cigar and blah, blah, blah. And we talked, and, he was sharing some of his history with church, and he's like, "Hey, what time does your church meet on Sunday mornings?" And so I'm like, oh, he might be coming to our church on Sunday. So worth the cigar at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
But you're right. That and today's supposed to be the day off, and that's why I'm smoking cigars with a neighbor and doing a podcast. So that's how it works.
Yeah,
that's how it works.
I know.
So, anyways, last time we heard you share your story about like how you got into church planting, and kind of where we're at now. And we use a phrase in our approach to church planting called apostolic church planting. And again, the word apostolic in some tribes is embraced, and in some tribes is not embraced. And that's a whole nother conversation with people smarter and better paid than us. But we're calling this apostolic church planting because we see it's the approach that Paul took as he was a part of the birth of the church at right after Christ, his death and his resurrection. And so what I'd love to do is start the conversation with you today. What are some of the church planting approaches that you've seen out in the world? And then why are we all in on this apostolic church plant approach, not minimizing and not discrediting those other ones? They're fantastic. They've been around for a long time, and there's been some really good success there. But why the apostolic approach? So before then, what are some of the different approaches out there that you've seen, you've experienced, and what are some of the pros and cons to those experiences?
There's probably 4 different ones. I mean, I'm sure there's multiple more than that, but I kind of see in 4 different types. One is the model that we see a lot of by the megachurches, where there's for lack of a better term, maybe a rock star pastor that they can video, send the messages to all the different campuses, and it ends up being kind of a multi-site.
Yeah, right.
But it's really, really focused around a rock star type of preacher or pastor or charismatic guy or person. And so that's one. And we've seen a lot of those that have been very successful from a numerical standpoint in the non-denom world.
Yep.
Then the next one is more in terms of a multi-site, which is just maybe a larger congregation wants to duplicate what they do. They already have the systems in place. They've already tried things out and have really honed in on maybe some things that are really important. And so they'll start another site in a different location and bring in a campus pastor, and sometimes they do live preaching, sometimes they do video preaching from a central campus, and so that's the second one.
Right, and a lot of that ministry, or even I know in the multi-sites, the messages are it's the same message, just delivered by a different person. So they're going through the same series, and kind of the thought process on a lot of multi-sites is, if you go to, the south side, you'll have a very similar church experience to if you happen to be in the north side. And so it really is one church in two locations type mentality. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's the one that I was involved in the first part of my ministry, and we made the facility look the same inside. The chairs were the same. The sermon series were the same, and some go to even as saying that the actual sermon is the same, and very little difference between who is actually delivering it. And there's a team of people that really generate the message. But usually the song lists are the same and all those. So, so whether no matter where you go, you're going to get the same experience, and there's some real value in that. People really appreciate that a lot.
So in some ways, it's like a Chick-fil-A. Where it's what's that called? Franchise. It's a franchise model. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can do it. Nope. Some places do it and do it extremely well. Absolutely. So, what else do you see out there?
Well, before we go to those, let's just talk about those first two. The challenge with the first one is if that rock star person that everything's built around ends up going away, or something happens, then there's some real challenge in that, unless they have a really good succession plan.
Right.
Or succession plan. So there's some real challenge with that. I mean, there's some value in that, but there's a challenge in that.
Well, and I think we've seen in the last decade, I would say maybe even in the last 5 years, some of those huge mega churches, because it's all built on that one personality. If that personality has a failing of some sort, it rocks the church in ways, because it's a single point of failure, and it's that charismatic, excellent teacher and what he's trying to bring to his people. And so, once you remove that piece from the puzzle, that church has a massive identity crisis. And sometimes in worst case scenarios, they just fold. They just end up ceasing to exist, which I think the long-term ramifications on the soul of those people can be really, really, really difficult. A lot of bitterness can set in and things like that. So, absolutely. Yeah. So what about the franchise model?
So again, there's some real positives about it, in that the resources are there. Usually you have the processes and systems in place, so you're not spending a lot of time developing those and generating cash and doing all of the administrative stuff in the background. So a church planter in that model has a lot more freedom or time to spend directly on some of the things that you and I both know is important to church planting. Things like the community listening and developing your team and really understanding all of that. And so there's a real beauty in that. The challenge is that if the needs of the multi-site is different than the needs of the main campus, then sometimes the organizational structure is really challenged with that and may not be able to adjust appropriately. Also, the multi-site at times, because the demands are so great at the main campus, sometimes the multi-site ends up feeling like that they're not really being heard. They're not really getting the things they need. And or maybe even not even given the ability or the authority to do some of the stuff that they might believe they need to do for that community. And so that's kind of the challenge of it. So there's some real beauty to it, but also there is this challenge with that franchise type of model.
A buddy of mine was just interviewed recently to be a multi-site pastor, and his reflection coming back is he's like, man, his concern, and he shared it with the church that was calling him, was that the mother church was in a very, very affluent suburb of a major metropolitan area. And their needs are so different. And where they were trying to plant this church was inner city, blue collar, like legacy neighborhood where the houses are just starting to turn over from people who have lived there for 50 years to their kids or grandkids. And he was like, I know what you guys want to do, but there's no way your approach to ministry in the suburb is going to work down here because they already hate anyone who wears a white collar. Like, like you don't understand. They don't want you. They don't want whatever you're selling. You need to have someone from this place, the street cred, to be able to speak into the hearts. And it was just something that the mother church had never really processed through. And I think that's the challenge that you're starting to identify is like, man, unless you're planting in the same context, just down the road, you need a completely different approach in those different areas.
Well, and for instance, in the site that I did in Colorado, the main campus was really in a tech area, high median income.
Yep. High education.
And the multi-site was in an ag town with probably half or a third of the median income. So it was like two totally different worlds, and it worked, and we were able to work together through it to make it happen. But there was a lot of challenges for all of us to figure out, okay, how do we take this DNA that we had, that God had helped develop at this successful place, and take the DNA part of it
right
with you to a new place, not losing the DNA, but also being a unique individual for that community. So it was an interesting dynamic. It really is.
Yeah. It can be successful, but I also know there's a handful of multi-sites that 5-10 years down, they figure out it's time to, I don't want to say divorce because that's absolutely a negative term, but split or to become autonomous. That's a better way to put it. And so they take a year or two to create that autonomous reality. They charter as a church, and now, and in those situations with that end point of autonomy, I see some long-term blessings there for sure. Sure.
There are.
So then, those are two approaches. Move forward. What are the other two approaches that you and I have been a part of?
Well, just I would say more a traditional approach that you and I both have been part of, and that is where you get parachuted into an area and you start from ground zero. You're figuring out what the community is all about, what the needs are. You start developing a team that's going to be the team that's going to be starting this new church. You raise resources or continue to maintain and the relationships with some of the people who are supplying the resources, and you're really starting from ground zero, figuring out what to do. And that's the one that that we did here in Killeen, Texas. And I'd ask you, Travis, how would you describe that more traditional one? Because you've been involved in that too, right?
Well, yes, I have, and it is. And I think it depends on the wiring of the pastor that's called into that situation. And we kind of talked about this in our last podcast. Was, there are a handful of guys that are wired to have those groundbreaking gifts, to go into a community where there's nothing that exists, there's no community that exists, there's no culture that exists in the church sense, to discover those things and to help pull from those people the vision and the mission, and then be able to make the shift they need to make leadership-wise to become a manager rather than an innovator. And that's different. And in the business world, it happens all the time where you have a guy who can innovate a product, it becomes overly successful, but then they realize right away they are not the guy to run the company to get the product into the hands of as many people as possible. So they bring in someone else to do that. And I think the more traditional approach is that guy who starts it is the guy that's expected to be there forever. And for me, the challenge was I was unable to develop those gifts because I don't think there were gifts that God had given me. And, like the weekly meetings that you need to have just drove me crazy. I love to develop hey, here's the way that we're going to do our meetings. And then the third time we do those meetings, I'm already in my mind thinking about how to deconstruct the whole thing and create a new system. And it drove people crazy. And that's why I think after 5 or 6 years in that same location with those same people, I was burning out people. I was burned out myself because I had left the unique calling that God had given me there. And again, it goes to what we talked about earlier on in this conversation was so much of it hinges on that charismatic personality of the pastor, that as that pastor moves on, people will follow the pastor and forget that they're actually there to follow Jesus. And that can sometimes be the challenge with that, let alone just all of the financial challenges of being a parachute pastor where you have 2 or 3 years of support, but the expectation is you're self-sufficient at that time. And, now you're trying to pay a pastor, pay his benefits, make sure that the family's cared for, as well as be self-sustaining as a church while renting a facility and trying to buy land, because we know there's a shift that happens in the community at least when you have a plan to go out and buy land, because there's this unspoken reality of like, okay, this is a permanent church. This will be here for my kids and my grandkids. And the investment that people will give to that is very different than a church that sets up and tears down in a cafetorium every single week, where literally today it could be here, tomorrow it could be gone. And we don't know. And so I think, there's a reason why churches have done that. There's a reason why there's entire cottage industry about evaluating those type of pastors to equip them to do that kind of ministry. But I think you and I have lived it to know there's some shortcomings in there as well. And that's why I'm excited about this new adventure that you and I are on, is this apostolic church planting approach. And so talk to us a little bit about that approach, what makes it unique, and why are we bringing that to the table, to the community, to say, hey, here's another option, and this might be your unique calling in this venture of church planting.
Well, I think you've talked a lot about it already, in that we're all wired differently. We're all gifted differently. God has different things for each of us to do. And let me just say that all of those church models have some value, and anybody who's listening to this or watching this, part of the assessment you need to do as an organization is what's the best model for your situation, for your church, for whatever, to go forward to start new churches, new locations. But the apostolic one is an interesting one, in that people like you and I, who are people, as you said, I think you said, I can't remember the word you used, but I call it kind of an architect side of it, that we're people that are architects and work with the builders to get the building put together, but we really need somebody to come in later to help maintain and improve and use it to its fullest, and that type of thing. And so an apostolic church planter and that type of approach is that you come in and you work with an existing team that's there. You lift that team up. You help them really check the pulse and the needs of the area that you're going into. You help them frame and lead them in framing what the needs are and how you're going to reach that community and how you're going to bring the gospel message and God's kingdom into that community in the unique way that God is calling you to do that in that community. And as an apostolic church planter, it ultimately, as we're trying to do here in Texas, is it may not be a church start right to begin with. Maybe what it's going to be is a house church, or maybe it's going to be a evangelist station, or maybe it's going to be going to an existing church and maybe helping them in a revitalization. And that's part of the apostolic movement. And so I think sometimes, Travis, I think we do it a disservice in calling it apostolic church planting. And sometimes I think we should be calling it apostolic movement. Maybe. I don't know what to use, but because it's beyond just a church plant. You may realize as you go in with a team that a new church start, as we would consider a new church start, isn't the right thing to go with to begin with.
And I think, again, this is not an idea that we came up with. This is something that Paul lived out in the early church, and that's what you see Paul doing. He would go into a community, he would stay there for a season, he would find those who God had already called to be a part of this ministry. He would gather them together on a regular basis to build community. But then there's times that he would go into a community that's already in existence, and he would set it straight, or he would reinvigorate it, or he'd redirect it and remind it, this is your mission. Stop arguing with each other about X, Y, or Z. That's not advancing the mission. Your mission is Jesus Christ and getting it into the reality of the people around you. So refocus on that. And but he would never, I would say he would never outstay his welcome, but there were times that
he did.
There's times that the towns were like, it's time for you to go, and if you don't listen to us, we'll stone you or put you in prison. And then God did miraculous things. So no, I totally agree with you. We don't want to narrow focus. It's just a planting approach. It is really a reinvigorating of ministry and not innovating, but investing in new ministry as well.
And one of the other things that's really, and we've talked briefly about it, is as an apostolic planter coming in, we're always working ourselves out of a job. We want to lift up a leader, a pastor that's there, and really encourage them. And then when we go, the other thing that's interesting to me is you're always touching base back, supporting those people.
Yes.
So it's not like we do in our call process where, man, when you get a call and you leave, you're done, and you're encouraged not to reach back out and be a part of that transition time and everything. But the apostolic approach is really, part of it is you support that team, that pastor, and your support over time diminishes because they become more and more confident. They don't need maybe the encouragement or the coaching or whatever. And so, that's a whole different mindset too for you and I in the tribe we're in.
Right. And the way that I'm thinking about it is like, when I was going through the church planting training and stuff like that, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of importance on like my vision and my mission. And I think the apostolic approach shifts that a little bit. And it's more of like, our job is to help the people that God's calling for that church plant to discover their mission and to discover their vision for that church in that location. Because the more it hinges on you or I, the more the pain is when we leave. And I do want to talk real quick, because I think a question that was asked of me early on in the process, before we had proof of concept that this thing was actually viable, was do you tell people from the beginning that you're going to leave? And how does that affect people's investment and buy-in to it? And so I'll share my story real quick. I had a great conversation with a family that was kind of starting to invest in the congregation, and the husband took me out for a drink one night, and that was his thing. He says, what's going to happen when you leave? And what I realized is that there's the families that are called to the church plant, there's probably 3 different things that God's uniquely calling them to. For some, they are what I call the critical mass families, and they're families that are called from other churches to be there for a season, maybe a year, maybe 2, to help fill in the gaps, to help give energy to things that need to be done, to help create an excitement within that community and within that church. But ultimately, God's going to call them back home to their previous congregation. And so it's like a long-term local mission trip for them kind of thing. Then there's some families that are called specifically to that church plant, and they are all in, and they are sacrificing, and this is where they're going to be baptizing their kids. Their kids will get married one day. They are like in. And then there's a third group that I think, and this is a small group, but I think there's a group that are called to follow the apostolic church planter to the next church plant, because they will be the kind of catalysts to get the conversations going and to get that the critical mass thing, and to be the words of encouragement, and to be, to really help till that ground earlier in the process than not. And he seemed to be comfortable with that. But I would love to know from you, Gerry, how did you navigate that when all of a sudden you're telling people from the beginning, hey, just so you know, I'm the guy starting it, but I'm going to be gone in 2 to 3 years. How did that conversation go, and how do you navigate that with folks?
What you said is really powerful, Travis. I think I believe it's really important up front to be very clear on what the model is. And the experience I've had is that people tend to be a lot more invested because it's theirs. They know it's going to be theirs. It's not all dependent upon the pastor. And so that's another thing that I wanted to mention about the apostolic planter like you and I. We have to be willing and able and really almost excited about delegating and letting people own this and hear what they believe God is calling them to do and what the church is called to do. And that in and of itself has been a really hard thing for me to learn. And I don't believe I could have done it early in my career.
No.
But it's really powerful now because I see them grabbing hold of it. I see God using them and opening their eyes to what his vision for it is. And they're all in. And that's a cool thing to see. I just, wow.
When the people of God, so I think a lot of us fall into, and this is, I think, throughout Christendom, it becomes easy for us to follow our pastor as our pastor follows Jesus, right? But there's something beautiful when we realize, because of Christ, his death, his resurrection, the forgiveness that he's given us at our baptism, and the unique gifting and calling he's given to us there as well, that we don't have to follow him through someone else. Like, we have direct access to Christ. And that while he has a unique vocation, us in our own vocations can actually follow him directly. There's no intermediary that we need anymore. The curtain temple's been ripped from top to bottom. And when families and people are on that literal cutting edge of, if God doesn't show up tomorrow, this whole thing's done. And then they see God show up, not because the pastor told them, hey, this is how God showed up, but they experience it, they taste it, they see it. Their faith is set on fire in ways that they've longed for, but had no idea how to experience. And that's one of the things that I love about it. And that's why I love, and going back to something you said earlier, to be an apostolic guy, you can't have an ego. Like, you cannot have an ego or want your name associated with things, because if you do, you are somehow, some way blocking out someone in the congregation that God has called to do that, and you're trying to do it yourself. And so I love your heart, and that's one of the things that is a learning process of how to just delegate, not dump, delegate these ministries and missions to people so that they're the ones tasting it, seeing it, and going, oh, our God is so good.
Yeah, and it's a challenge. I struggle, and I'll learn until I die how to do it, because I find myself grabbing it and bringing it back, and I go, I can't do this. And that isn't the way I would have done it, but it's the way it should be done, because God called him to do it, and I have to keep reminding myself of that, and it's pretty exciting actually to see it happen. You're three groups. I think it's really a great look at the people that come, but I would add a fourth.
Oh, okay.
And a fourth group is the people that are kind of the fringe people that are kind of interested. They're just kind of looking and checking it out just to see what it's about, because it's the most exciting thing that's coming, and there's some buzz about it, and they're just kind of checking it out. And that's really a challenge for the team a lot of times, in that the people, they aren't as committed.
Right.
They kind of want to be there. They kind of want to get some of the excitement, but are they all in or not? And so what we try to do is just love them where they're at. And if God lays on their heart to be a part of it, great. If it ends up not being the place for them, we joyfully let them go to and bless them. And so, but that's an interesting group that in every place we've been, there's that group of people that kind of show up and it, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. And I was going to say, and part of that conversation is those who are giving so much, the language that I use is we want to always invite them to be involved, but we never want to demand them be involved.
Exactly.
And that's a really fine line, because those who are giving so much from a very pure place, they're like, well, how do we demand them to be involved more? And you're like, no. You can't do that. It's always an invitation of like, hey, do you want to get involved here? No? Okay, cool. Then God loves you where you're at, and we're excited that you're here. And so that's the tension for me, is wanting to go to them and say and demand it rather than always invite it.
Yeah, we struggle with that all the time, but it's interesting. I've seen both directions. I've seen where people have come and been in a short season and contributed some things, but then they really realized that it wasn't the right place for them, and they went wherever, and that was great. But there's also some that I see God change their hearts and grab hold of them, and they're all in, and so it's kind of a cool. That group of people is interesting just to watch and just to love and to be with and try to figure out what's kind of what God's messing with them with.
and when you finally have that conversation for them, and they're like, we love this place, but we didn't know why, and now we're all in, and they make that answer to the invitation. I mean, they become like it's the very wind in the sail that keeps the ship moving. It's the motivation and it's the momentum that you're like going, see, God is working. See, God is influencing lives. See, we are connecting with the de-churched and the unchurched and those who have been hurt by the church and are finally finding a place to be healed in the church. And it's making a difference. Gerry, I really do appreciate your time. I cannot thank you enough. For those of you guys listening, always multiple podcasts are out on groundbreakerlife.com. You can find them and follow them. If you want to, like us on Facebook. We'll be putting out a podcast once, twice a month, 3 times a month, maybe 4 if we're lucky. And just having conversations about apostolic church planting itself, helping answer questions to guys as you are starting to engage with us, questions you might have, your family might have, and wives of church planters. Trust me, we are going to do an entire series just for the wives of church planters, and it's going to be less of Gerry and I and more of our wives, because you guys are on a unique journey that no one understands unless you're in the trenches there. And so love you guys, love the mission and ministry that God has for you and that God has you on, and we are excited to see the different Groundbreakers to Harvesters ministries and missions that start out there. So any final words, Gerry?
Just follow Jesus. He's faithful.
On that note, God bless you and have a great day.